And they didn't even have what I wanted. Part 1. I'm driving through a snowstorm on an empty gas tank, and my girlfriend's mother wants scotch. My girlfriend's brothers and sisters are hollering for food, and I'm figuring like mad. Got $5. It's supposed to be dollar night at the drive-in movie, which leaves me $4 to grandstand with. Plenty for hot dogs, but a bottle of scotch can wipe me out. It's their car, and if they want a tank full of gas out of me, that'll wipe me out too. But if I take a chance and we run dry, and I have to call a cab, we better stop and get some gas, Dick, says Marianne's mother. You're so right, I'm looking for a gas station right now, I say, passing one on each side of the road. Every traffic light winks at me as if to say, if you're lucky, you'll get arrested. I jump every light, but nothing happens. Never find a cop when you want one. Gas station, there's a gas station, yells one of the four little kids in the back. I pull in alongside the pump and lean out. Fill her up, baby. Then I jump out of the car and run to the back. Just $1 worth, please. Through the window, I can see Marianne's mother talking away at her daughter in the front of the car. The four little kids are rubbing their hungry bellies in the back seat. They are all very impressed to be going out with such a big entertainer. Dick Gregory, master of ceremonies and star comic of the Esquire show lounge of Chicago, buys his suits at Lighton's and has his own apartment. I get back into the car, looking very put out. What's wrong, Dick? Hell, I didn't like that man's attitude. I never spend my money with the man whose attitude I don't like. You're so right, says the mother. Why, I was telling Marianne only yesterday that. Now, if I can get Marianne off alone and explain the situation to her, I'm all right. I don't have to be phony with her. Of course, it would never dawn on me to embarrass the girl in front of her folks. Besides, people just don't like to know that such a big entertainer makes $30 a week, buys his clothes on the credit of a landlady who works night at a drugstore, and rents a basement room. Sure is cold, says the mother. We're almost there. Get us some good hot coffee. Some scotch will warm us up faster, Dick. Liquor store, there's a liquor store, yells a kid. Like God strung it down from heaven, right across the highway is this big sign. Last liquor store before driving. Even I can't miss it, and I'm trying. I pull over and get out. I never bought whiskey before. I walk right up to the guy behind the counter. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see the sign. Special on scotch. $1.25 a pint. I'm saved. Marianne and I won't drink. Her mother can have the whole pint. I run back to the car. Didn't they have any cups, Dick? Asked Marianne's mother. Things are very tight now. Got $2.50, and something tells me I read the newspaper wrong. Just my luck it's not dollar night after all. By the time we pull up to the box office, I'm in a cold sweat despite the freezing weather. I'm sure it's not dollar night. That will be $1, mister. What the hell you mean? The paper said $1. That's just what I said, mister. $1. Now I'm scared again. The only other time I've been to a drive-in movie was 2 years ago, in college. How did the driver do it? Where do you park? Where do you get the speaker and the heater? We're holding up traffic, Dick. It's no trouble at all, and I'm so thankful I give the kids the rest of the money to buy hot dogs and soda. My stomach is turning over, and my hands are still shaking. And thank God everybody's quiet now, watching the movie, and I can close my eyes and figure out how I got here in the first place. It had been a short trip, that train ride from Carbondale to Chicago, but some of the days that followed were very long. Presley had left his rooming house with no forwarding address, but his landlady let me stay there for a few days until I got a Christmas job at the post office and a hotel room. I kept flipping the letters to Mississippi in the foreign slot, but I held the job until January. I hadn't made any friends in Chicago, and I couldn't get another job. I was on my way back to the train station with no destination in mind when I ran into a guy I had run track with back in high school. I remember standing on a windy corner, getting colder and colder, just talking to keep from going to that station. I told the guy about college, about the Army, about Lieutenant Jim Ellis. "You mean Tank Ellis, the football player?" said the guy. "Man, I was over his house last night on a party." "Where's he live?" 5103 Wabash. I started running. When Jim Ellis' door opened, things began to open up for me in Chicago. He treated me like a long-lost brother, and he got me a job with him out at Ford Aircraft. After work, we go to the park together and run to get him in condition for the pro football tryouts in the spring. I ran, and it felt good as that old machine started to get into shape. I was beating Jim every day. He wasn't a track man, but it's a nice feeling to beat an All-American. Jim had a fast, hip crowd that threw a lot of parties, and I was swinging with people that liked me and my jokes. When Jim left for summer camp, I started running with the University of Chicago track team and made more friends, like Herbert Joubert and Ira Murchison. Murch was the fastest 100-yard dash man in the world and had records to prove it. I started seeing Presley, who was a door-to-door salesman, and Ron, my youngest brother, who was a track star at the University of Notre Dame. And in September, I moved in with Ozell and William Underwood, a young couple who had a basement room to rent. They treated me like a member of the family. I lost the Ford job in October, but it wasn't so bad. Whenever I was depressed, I could put on that tracksuit and run. After a while, I fell into the habit I had in high school, running early in the morning and at night when people were going and coming from work. I wanted to be seen. I had a good Christmas with the Underwoods, and I was able to call St. Louis and tell Dolores and Garland and Pauline I was doing all right, and take the train to visit Ron in South Bend. But then January came and I was still out of work, and there was something about unemployment compensation that began to remind me of relief. The way they made you stand in line, the way they narrowed their eyes when they asked questions. I was getting more and more depressed, and there seemed to be less and less time to run it out of my system. I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't getting anywhere. And then, on a Saturday night in late January, I hooked up with the monster again, in a nightclub. Ozell and William were having some people over that night, and I slipped out early. I didn't feel social. I caught a double feature and just started walking up streets I didn't even remember, into a South Side neighborhood I had never seen before. There was a little neighborhood nightclub on the corner, jukebox, and entertainment on the weekends. The place was packed with Saturday night faces, happy faces. I walked in. The master of ceremonies was the comic, and his material was blue and old, but after a while I was laughing too, and I had forgotten the reason I was out that night. After the show, I went backstage and told the man how much I had enjoyed his routine. We started talking, and I told him I was a comedian too. I gave him my last $5, and he let me follow his act on the next show. "Got a man here that's supposed to be funny," he said to the crowd. Let's bring him on and find out. I went out there scared, and I wasn't funny at first. I started talking and creating, and I don't remember what I said, but after a while I was getting respectful laughs. The MC came out and took the microphone back. "You're a real funny man," he said. "You'll go far in show business." I wasn't sure then if he was being sarcastic or not, but I figured I had done pretty well, getting even weak laughs on clean material after following his blue jokes. The next Saturday night, I went to another Negro nightclub, the Esquire Show Lounge. I slipped Flash Evans, the MC, $5, and this time I got a nice introduction, and I followed the band's first set. I gave a masterpiece of a show that night. I just felt right and cool, and the crowd had come to laugh. I never let them stop laughing, hit them hard and fast with jokes on processed hair and outer space and marijuana and integration and the numbers racket and long white Cadillacs and the man downtown and my dumb cousin and my mother-in-law and the world situation. By the time I stopped, my handkerchief was soaked, and I had run out of cigarettes, and I felt like I had passed them all, snatched them off like weeds, and broken the tape. When I came off stage, the owner of the Esquire took me in the corner. The cheap son of a bitch let me buy myself a drink and asked me if I'd like to start as MC in 2 weeks. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. $10 a night. I sat there and I looked at that man and I couldn't believe him. He said it again. I didn't know how I was going to wait until my opening night. It came, finally, and I wasn't funny at all. It's one thing to be funny when you're a guest on another man's stage. Something else again when it's your stage and you have to be funny night after night. My training began, but it was beautiful because the people in the Esquire were like a new family. The customers in the Esquire were like the student body when I was president of the class, and the women looked up to me as the big entertainer. For a girl like Marianne, I was the biggest entertainer she knew. "Dick, wake up now, the movie's over." "Wasn't sleeping, baby." I'm not about to tell her I was starring in a little movie of my own. I start the car and slip it into gear and the tires just whine. We don't move. First, second, reverse, first again. We're stuck in the snow. I get out of the car and walk around it. The back tires have spun themselves deep into the ice and slush. A lot of other cars at the drive-in are stuck too. 7 white boys, mean-looking cats in jeans and boots and black leather jackets with a million zippers, are pushing the cars out. I watch them. They swagger up to a car whose tires are spinning, and one of them says, "Okay, mister, you're next. $5." They get their 5, and they all get around the car and push it out toward the gate. Then they turn to another car. If the first car gets stuck again before it gets out on the highway, the 7 cats will push it again for another 5. I don't even have a dime. I get back into the car. "We're hungry," say the little kids in the back. I have to get them home quick. The tires whine some more. "Okay, mister, you're next. $5." "Thanks anyway," I say. "I think I can get it out myself." The windshield is steamed up and the tires spin and whine some more. "It's getting awfully cold, Dick," says Marianne's mother. "Why don't you let those boys push us out?" "I regard this as a personal challenge, man over the forces of nature," I tell her. "We hungry," say the kids. "Man must triumph over nature. I must get this car out myself or perish in the attempt," I say. "But it's only snow," says Marianne's mother. "Yeah, but it's white snow," I say, a very good line, but no one laughs. The tires keep spinning. "Well, you're ruining the tires," says Marianne's mother, angry now. Then I get out of the car and I walk over to the 7 white cats with all their zippers. I might as well be a fool out here than in that car. I just look at them and I say, how in the world can you start out right and end up wrong? I'm not trying to steal anything and I'm not trying to do anything shady, but this is what happened. And they stand there quietly in the snow around me in a circle, and people are shouting and honking their horns and waving money. I explain the whole thing to them. I tell them the whole story about my girl's car and her mother and the gasoline and the scotch and the hot dogs and Dollar Day, and they look at each other and nod their heads. And the biggest of these cats says, "Get back in your car, mister, and roll down your window so we can get a grip." And I am almost crying as they are pushing for a friend, 100 yards, then another 100 yards, out of the spin holes and past the box office, and out the gate, and they wave as I drive onto the highway. And I lean out and yell, "Thanks, baby," like I just laid $50 a piece on them. And now I'm driving down the highway, and I look down on my lap, and there's a $5 bill there that one of those beautiful cats slipped through the open window while he was pushing the car. "We better get some gas." "How much do you want?" "Just enough to get home on." I'm smiling and laughing and crying and telling jokes as I pull alongside that beautiful pump. And when the attendant runs out, I just turn my head and say, "Fill her up, baby, all the way up, and don't forget to check the oil." Chapter 2. The Esquire Show Lounge is a big, rectangular room attached to a neighborhood bar on the south side of Chicago. The room has chrome luncheonette-type tables and chairs with red plastic seats. The customers buy bottles at the bar and get glasses and paper buckets filled with ice and cherries at their tables. There are red lights around the room, faded murals on the walls, and entertainment on the weekend. An MC, a four-piece band, a shake dancer, some amateur talent now and then, and Guitar Red, an albino Negro who gets more out of an electric guitar than any man has a right to. He even plays with his feet. People come from all over Chicago to hear Guitar Red, and on Saturday nights there were lines around the block. But I was master of ceremonies, and I introduced the acts, and you had to get past me before you could see Guitar Red. I felt it was my show, and I felt like the Esquire Show Lounge was my home and my stadium. All week long I would train for that Friday night show that started my weekend. For the first time since high school, I got that thirsty taste again, waiting each week to go out and crush the world. Only now I didn't have to beat anybody. I had to make people happy. Every day during the week, I'd be working out for that 3-day meet, buying comedy records, buying joke books, watching television, listening to people, going to the library and digging into musty old books of humor and finding out where those comedy records got their material from. I walked downtown and spent money for books and magazines I couldn't even afford. And along the way, I'd hang out in the Walgreens at 63rd and Chicago Grove and on corners and anywhere people were, listening to them talk, trying out thoughts and ideas and jokes on strangers. Ozell and William would stay up half the night listening to new routines, and Ira Murchison and Herb Jubert and Jim Ellis would tell me what they liked and what they thought should go. I'd go to parties and just talk and create and clown, and if something got a good response, I'd mark it down in the back of my mind. Morning, noon, and night, 24 hours a day, trying to develop a mind like I once developed a body, watching, listening, talking. Hours and hours of television. The Ed Sullivan Show, the Jack Parr Show, every comedy show, even funny old movies, and then the news shows, the soap operas, the westerns, the series. What makes people laugh? What are people thinking about? And then you watch the stars. How do they act? How do they dress? I went down to Layton's, a big department store in the Loop, and convinced them I was making $100 a week and had been working for 4 years. Ozell and William helped me get clothes on credit. New shoes, new suits, new shirts. Change everything between shows. For the regular customers, you're the biggest entertainer they know. You have to look it. Keeping my clothes clean and buying records and books cost me as much as I was making. But I was selling a talent that wasn't really mine yet, and I had to develop it from every angle. I was hung up in something, and I had to find out how it worked. Now people were beginning to say, "There goes Dick Gregory," again, and it was greater than track ever was because it was all for me. It didn't include the mother's sons who had to lose so I could win. Between my shows, I talk to people and sit at tables and walk around and shake hands. I met a lot of girls, and I started going around with some of them. And I made rules for myself. Never go to a man's table if you think the woman with him is giving you the eye. That man is paying your salary. Not much, but he doesn't know that, and he deserves respect. He has the right to feel comfortable with his lady in the club. Never pick up the money that's thrown on stage. There were nights when there was more money on that stage than I was making in a week. But I never let anyone know I needed that money. I was the big entertainer. Never let a man pay me to introduce him and his party from the floor. If he knew I'd take that kind of money, he couldn't respect me. It's a wild thing about a small nightclub with ordinary working class people. You can get that same kind of respect there you can get in the big downtown nightclub. You're those people's entertainer. The biggest one they know. Probably the biggest they will ever know. The stars on the top have created such an atmosphere of glamour that even the entertainers on the bottom can step in and get respect. That's why you have to knock yourself out to dress well and act right and keep yourself up. You can never say, "Look here, I'm just a small-time entertainer and my suits don't have to be pressed, or my act too sharp, or my manners right." Where you are, you're just as big as Milton Berle and Bob Hope and Sammy Davis and Nipsey Russell. You're the big fish in the little pond. One Sunday after my afternoon show, a girl came out of the audience and asked me to come back to her table and give some autographs. She said she'd like me to meet her sisters. I told her I'd be delighted. That's why it's so important to be nice and polite to people. You can never tell when you're going to meet your future wife. I walked over and there was a young girl at the table, very bashful, very excited. She was twisting her napkin to death and giggling out of embarrassment. When I sat down, it was like God came over to the table. She had never been in a nightclub before. She was from Willard, Ohio, a small town, and her name was Lillian Smith. She was a secretary over at the University of Chicago. "You're fooling me, baby. You really working at the university?" "No, I mean, yes, I'm not fooling you." "Well, look, Lillian, I'm over there nearly every day to run track. Let's have lunch one day." She tucked her head down and started giggling, and she said, "Oh no, you don't really mean that." "Tell you what, Lillian, give me your phone number. I'll call you and tell you exactly what day we'll have lunch." She was so nervous while she was writing it down, she kept tearing the paper with her pencil point. I rolled up the paper and put it in my pocket. Lillian Smith stayed through the second show and the Sunday evening show, and she kept staring at me like she was afraid nobody in Willard, Ohio would ever believe she had actually talked to this great man. When I left that night with the girl I was dating at the time, I went over and said goodnight to Lillian. I thought it might give her a thrill to call her, just because she was so sure I wouldn't. That night, back at Ozell and Williams, I lay in bed and thought about the face staring up at me. That soft little girl face, so out of place in a nightclub. It suddenly dawned on me that my mother would have looked that way if she had ever been to a nightclub. I had a dream that night about Mama, and I was Richard again, and she came off the streetcar and ran into the house and said, "Richard, oh Richard, I spoke to the star of the show, Harry Belafonte. I talked to Harry Belafonte." And I said, "No, Mama." And she said, "Yes, I did. I really did. And he's going to call me on the phone." When I woke up that Monday morning, I called Lillian, and I could almost see her expression over the phone. I just talked to her and told her I'd call her back soon and we'd have lunch. That was around the middle of April in 1958, and I only saw Lillian a few times. She was so bashful and shy, sometimes I just ran out of words. But I was getting better and better at the Esquire. I worked harder, got to be a night owl so I could go to the bars and restaurants where other show people hung out when they were finished working. I couldn't afford to watch them work, but I could always buy coffee or a drink and talk to them and listen. I used to walk into those places where nobody knew me, and I used to tell myself that someday I'd walk in there and everybody would turn around and say, "Hi, Greg." They knew me at the Esquire, though. My crowd. People were beginning to come to see me, not just for Guitar Red or Paul Bascom's band or the Shake Dancer. I'd MC the show, and then I'd play bongos with Paul's band, then give my act, and MC the show some more, watching the time, keeping things moving like the patrol boy, like the president of the senior class. I'd go out to the show folks' after work spots, get some sleep, spend the days working on my material, reading, listening, trying my routines on anybody who would sit still. I guess it got to be too much because in the summer I came down with yellow jaundice. The day I went to the hospital, I called Lillian at her job. She was very concerned and very sweet, even though I hadn't talked to her in more than a month. It was like calling Mama. I was in the hospital for 6 weeks, impatient and angry at missing all those weekends at the Esquire, but it was the first time I ever really slowed down enough to look back down the road and up ahead. I thought about track, and I thought about Doc Lingle, how he used to tell me to take speech and music to prepare for a career in show business. He knew. And that old lady who had seen a star in the middle of my head, she knew too. I was going to go all the way. There were a lot of visitors at the hospital, friends, performers, and customers from the Esquire. Girls. A lot of noise, a lot of talking. When the room finally would clear out, there was Lillian, standing shyly in the corner. The first time she came, she brought me candy bars and grapes. You're not supposed to bring things into a Veterans Administration hospital, but I knew Lillian hadn't sneaked that paper bag past the desk. Some people can just walk into a place and never be stopped and never be questioned. She would stand there, her eyes full of concern, and we hardly talked because she was so shy, and I couldn't always find things to say to her. When visiting hours were over, the first time she asked if she could come back. I said no. It was too far to come at night. Her eyes seemed to fill up. I explained it wasn't that I didn't want her, it was just such a long trip. She asked me what she could bring the next time. I asked for something to read. When she came back, she brought Life and Time, and Newsweek, and Look, and the Saturday Evening Post, and the Reader's Digest, all the magazines I had always wanted to read every week. the magazines I felt I should keep up with but could never afford. She brought me 2 cartons of cigarettes. I had never had 2 cartons at a time. She slipped everything into the drawer, and we tried to hold a conversation for a little while, and then I told her to go before it got too late. After she left, I reached into the drawer for a cigarette. There were 2 rolls of dimes in there for the telephone and some cigarette money. $100. I counted it 5 times. I couldn't believe it because it was just like Mama would have acted if she were a rich girl like Lillian Smith. When I got out on a 3-day pass from the hospital, I took Lillian to a movie. She was so happy, it was like offering her the world. I went right back to work after I got out of the hospital, and it was like romping and stomping through the neighborhood after the levee and the prom and the Wood River meet and the senior class speech all wrapped into one Friday night, where the customers stood and clapped and cheered when I walked back up on my stage. Only they weren't clapping for any gladiator. They were saying, "Man, we're really glad you're back. We missed you. Like, how was it?" Did a hell of a show that night, just talking about the hospital, the nurses, the doctors, the other patients, and when it was over, everybody crowded around and told me they were planning to come out and visit me next week, or they would have sent me a card, but they didn't have the address, and they said it like they meant it. Somebody brought me some flowers. Oh man, I kept romping and stomping all that fall, and my shows got better and better, and the lines got longer and longer, and more people were coming out just to hear me. Lil and I were going out pretty often now, and I carry her out to the club to see my act, and we talk about my work, and she type up material for me at her job. I was such a big man now, I went right up to the Esquire owners, and I told them I was due for a raise. Been here almost a year. I'm packing the place every night, and $10 a night just isn't enough money for a comic like me. I want $12 a night. They told me $10 a night was plenty. I told them if they didn't give me a $2 raise, I'd quit on them. They didn't give me a raise. When I quit the Esquire, I had that same funny feeling in my stomach I had felt when I left college with nowhere to go. Everyone was behind me. I spent most of December lying around the house, reading and watching television. Toward Christmas, I played a couple benefits just to make me feel I was still an entertainer. It was at one of those benefit shows that somebody mentioned there was an old vacant nightclub for rent out in Robbins, Illinois. It was owned by a woman named Sally Wells. I called her, and she said the rent was $56 a night. I told her not to make a move until we could get together. Ira Murchison drove me out in his car the next day, a 19-mile trip, and I talked non-stop the whole way. My own nightclub. I could do anything I wanted. I'd be my own boss. I'd do more topical material and less blue material. I'd gain respect as an owner and a performer. I'd develop new talent. I'd pay good salaries. I'd create an atmosphere for good comedy. Everybody would be happy. Ira didn't say a word. He didn't even ask me what I was going to use for money. Sally Wells was a woman in her 70s, and the Apex Club was the most raggedy-looking nightclub in the world. A small, dusty, creaky, empty room. It looked a little haunted. We were peeking around the room, the three of us, when Sally Wells suddenly turned to Ira and stared at him with her bright, glittering eyes. "You've been overseas," she said mysteriously, "and you're going back again." "Yeah, that's right. How do you know?" said Ira. The year before, he had represented the United States in the Moscow track meet and was planning to go again. Then she turned to me, and I had the same strange feeling I had 20 years before when one of Mama's spiritualist readers said she saw a star in the middle of my head. I see you flying all over this country, from one end to another, with a little brown case in your hand, said Sally Wells. Now I was really impressed. I had always had the idea, for some reason, that all the top comics carried their material in brown leather briefcases. I also see you getting married soon. Nope, you're wrong there. There's a little matter of having to be in love first. Sally Wells shook her head. I see you getting married. I humored her because I was trying to make a business deal, and then we changed the subject. We sat and we talked and figured things out. I'd pay her $168 a week for using the club Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. There was insurance and licenses and cleaning and heat and electricity and water and taxes. By the time Ira and I left Robbins and headed back north to Chicago, Dick Gregory was in business. One of the first things I did was borrow $800 from Lillian, my rich ace in the hole. We had gotten pretty close. Then I went to every newspaper in Chicago, white and Negro, and took out ads. In the big papers, good-sized ads with printed directions for getting out to Robbins cost $65 a day. I was going first class. I brought glasses and tables and chairs. Went around to entertainers I knew and hired a band and some acts. I knew I needed a car, and Mary Ann had one. I asked her if she would like to be my new head cashier. She was fascinated by the idea. I hired a few other girls I knew as waitresses. Then I went to buy whiskey. I had never been much of a drinker, but I learned more about liquor in 2 weeks than most people learn in a lifetime. Scotch, bourbon, gin, vodka, rye, wines, brandies, and every kind has a dozen different brands. I finally talked a liquor store owner on 63rd and St. Lawrence into letting me have $1,000 worth of liquor for the first weekend. I would pay for only what was used and open, bring everything else back. I convinced him that when I hit it big with the club, he'd get all my business. Then all I needed was beer and different kinds of soda. That first Friday in January, I loaded everything into the car and headed out to Robbins. Opening night was only hours away. Halfway out, I realized I had no change. I drove back to town and persuaded Ozell, my landlady, to borrow change from her boss at the drugstore. She had to promise to stand good for $100 worth of silver. Halfway out again, I remembered I need ice for the beer and cubes for the drinks. Back again, out again. Then lemons. Then pick up 2 of the waitresses, one singer, and the girl who owned the car. At 7 o'clock, I opened the doors of the Apex Club and leaned back with a smirky smile to watch the people trample each other in the mad dash to get in. By 9 o'clock, there were 4 customers. They got very good service. At 10, we had a dozen, mostly friends, but by 11 o'clock, the Apex Club was more than half filled. And baby, I'm a nightclub owner. I never worked so hard in my life. Did I ever move that night? One of the acts hasn't shown up. Run out and call them. Introduce the band. A guy comes in without a tie. Hustle him out. Run out of change. Scuffle up some more. Introduce the singer. Need more lemons. Guy without a tie is back. Hustle him out again. Introduce the dancer. Customer isn't satisfied. Go pacify him. Money drawer stuck. Unstick it. Somebody wants a fancy drink. Go buy a bottle of creme de menthe. Introduce the guitar player. Glasses are coming out of the kitchen dirty. Send them back and bawl out the waitress. Guy without a tie is back. Go get him one. 2 men get up to fight. Jump in between them. More change. Customer says he was shortchanged. A lie, but give him money anyway. Go up and do my act. A masterpiece of a show. Another fight. calm them down and buy them drinks. Drawer stuck. More change, more lemons, more change, more change. Time to close. Clear everybody out. Count the liquor, count the money, put the beer back in the cases, cokes back in the cartons, load everything in the car because one robbery here will wipe me out. Drive back to Chicago, too tired to carry everything inside, sleep in the car. Saturday night, we had a big live crowd, a full house. It was twice as wild as Friday night, and I worked 10 times as hard, and it was beautiful. I got up on stage and I gave two great shows, mostly topical material right out of the newspapers. And by the time we closed up, we had $1,200 in the till. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know whether I was opening a club or closing it. I was so tired, but I knew I had $1,200 in the sack. We ran afternoon and evening shows that Sunday to fairly respectable houses. By Monday morning, I was in the pawn shop and at friends' houses, scraping up enough to pay the next week's ads and rent. The $1,200 wasn't mine very long, with all the back bills. The only performers I paid for the first weekend were the bandsmen. They belonged to a union that would have closed the place, but I wasn't more than $1,000 in debt now, and things were rolling, and I knew after the second weekend I'd be almost clear, and after that I'd have to hire someone to help me count the money. I saved that expense at least. The next Friday we got 13 inches of snow. 13 inches of snow and 3 customers. I stood in the back of my club that night, and I swore that when I really hit it big and went to appear in another man's nightclub, I would refuse to take a penny if the weather was so bad that nobody showed up. I would never take a cent if there was a tornado or a hurricane or blizzard. I thought about that for a while. I had time that night. Yeah, I thought that's okay when you're thinking as an owner. But don't forget all those $10 nights at the Esquire when you showed up on bad nights, even when the customers didn't. You were going there to make your rent money, not spend it. Saturday came with 5 more inches of snow and sleet too. The highways were bad, and we were 19 miles out of downtown Chicago. 20 people showed up. There were 20 on Sunday, and 2 more inches of snow. It was only the beginning of one of the worst winters we ever had in Chicago. The third and fourth weekends had snow and sleet and hail and freezing rain. Most nights there were more employees than customers in the Apex Club. I paid the girls with promises. Promises that the weather would break, that we hit it big, that they'd all get their back pay and more. They believed me. I borrowed more money to keep the place going. I pawned and sold everything I could get my hands on. I began to resent the bandsmen who didn't drink heavily on the job. They weren't leaving their salaries in the club. The liquor store owner began to complain because I was bringing too much whiskey back. So I began to start each night with a pint of gin, vodka, bourbon, and scotch, 6 cans of beer, and a couple of cartons of soda. As I sold out, I'd run out to a small package store across the street and buy more. There were nights I didn't have to buy more, and the rent went on, and the advertising went on. I was sinking so far into debt I couldn't see straight. On Thursday, January 29th, 1959, I decided it was time to play my ace in the hole again. My rich girl. I went to see Lillian Smith. She was very sweet, but apologetic. All she could give me was $300. She had quit her job at the university, and she was leaving town. I had to ask her twice before she told me why. "I'm pregnant, Greg. I'm going to have a baby." The words felt as though someone had taken a bucket of ice water and splashed it against my naked guts. "That's all I need now, a baby, everything I'm trying for, everything I'm killing myself for, and no money and no real home. And I don't want to bring up any baby that's going to be brought up as poor as I was brought up. We sat and we talked, and I asked Lil questions. No, she wasn't rich. She had saved some money for college, and when she left after a year, she had kept the money in the bank. She had already given most of it to me. Yes, she had known about this for some time. She was about 4 months pregnant. But you've been so busy and working so hard, Greg. I just didn't want to. And now I'm not listening to her, and I'm thinking that as poor as the Gregory kids were, and as ornery and as rotten and as no good as Big Prez was, at least we all had a name. Big Prez had given us that. I asked Lil to marry me. She refused. She said she didn't want to do anything to stand in my way. This time I didn't ask her. I told her. Friday we got the blood test and bought the license. And on Monday, February 2nd, 1959, I was a married man. Old Lady Wells was right. At midnight on Monday, Lil and I got on a Greyhound bus for St. Louis, 300 miles down, sleeting all the way through the night. I told her that everything would be all right. The weather would break soon, the nightclub would hit, and I'd bring her back to Chicago and be a husband and a father. She was very brave. Lil was going to a city where she knew no one, to live with people she barely knew existed. I had no idea how hard it was going to be for her then. That Tuesday was one of the worst days St. Louis ever had. Rain and snow and driving sleet. The buses weren't running, there were no cabs, and the insurance companies had announced that no cars would be covered that day. We finally found a guy bootlegging rides, and he took us to the project where my sister Dolores lived and her 3 kids. Dolores was separated from her husband and was working as a waitress. Times were tough for her too, but she was good and kind, and she welcomed Lil. I saw some of my kinfolk in St. Louis, and I asked everybody to help, and I talked to Lil some more. Then I went back to Chicago and the Apex Club. Chapter 3. It's impossible to be in the nightclub business for 6 months and never make a penny. Absolutely impossible. I'll never believe it happened to me. Somehow it seemed as though the harder we worked, the worse the weather got. There were weeks in February and March when the weather would break clear and warmer on Wednesday, and I'd tell the waitress who had never been paid, and the friends who had gone to a finance company for me, and the head cashier who had taken a second job to give me liquor money, I was right. Baby, here we go now. This is the weekend. This beautiful thing happens. Then Friday would smash down on us with snow and sleet and 10 degrees. There were nights I was so tired and confused and half crazy that I thought the winter was a giant trick created just for me, a way for God to test my soul. I'd go up on stage and be funny and develop and try not to think of what I was going to say to the bill collector at the side table when I came down again. By March, I couldn't afford to advertise anymore or pay my room rent to Ozell and William or the club rent to Sally Wells. The Underwoods themselves were sinking deeper into debt over me, and Sally Wells was laying out money for my heat, electricity, water, license, and taxes. The nightclub acts haven't been paid in so long that they're hassling with me and with each other. The husband and wife team is splitting up, and the girl singer is fighting every night with her boyfriend, and the only thing I can give these people is hope and free liquor. But the hope is wearing thin, and my friends are pawning their clothes to pay my whiskey bill, and behind everything else is the realization that I have to hit by May because I don't want my baby born in a city hospital. There were nights when I ran across the street for another half pint that all I wanted to do was pass the liquor store and turn the corner and put my head down and lift my knees and salute the lamppost and take off. Just keep running. Greg, just keep running. I never sent Lil a penny, and by April I couldn't afford to call St. Louis anymore. Then the Underwood's telephone was turned off for non-payment. Some of my friends began to turn against me. I couldn't blame them. You can't keep saying tomorrow to a man who borrowed $500 for you and now his paycheck is being garnished and he might lose his job. You can't say tomorrow to Thelma Isbell, a woman with 3 children who might be put out of her apartment, to people who are going to lose things they pawned for you. But you say tomorrow and you say next week, and then tomorrow and next week roll around, and you have to explain it to them all over again. The snow is going to melt, and the sun is going to come out, and the Apex Club is going to have a real live crowd again. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. You say it when Ozell is sick, and William is laid off, and the waitress's children are hungry. You say it when you're lying on the floor, too weary to put up your hands, just enough to keep your friend from punching you in the face again. Just lie there and wish you were dead and know you couldn't be that lucky. And now that as bad as things are, they are 10 times worse for Lillian, living with strangers in a strange city, waiting for a baby whose father never calls. The second week in May, a man walked into the Apex Club with a gun. There were 6 customers in the club that night, and they jumped up and ran out. The waitresses and the bandsmen and the acts flattened out against the walls and froze when he walked around the tables, kicking chairs out of his way and waving the gun at the girl behind the money drawer. I came down off the stage and walked right up to him and looked him right in the eyes. "Look, mister, you don't know what I've been through, or you wouldn't come in here with that gun. You'd come in here with money." He looked at me as if I were crazy, and he motioned me out of his way with the gun. I didn't move. I was crazy. "Listen, mister, one of us has to die tonight. What I've gone through all winter with this place, you need to pull a gun and shoot me to run me out of here. God himself couldn't run me out of here, and he's tried." The man looked at me and shook his head. He had been down to the nitty-gritty himself. I guess because he put his gun back in his pocket and said he was sorry, he turned and walked out. I scuffled up enough money that week to have the Underwood's phone turned back on, and the first call that came through was Dolores, and she said the baby was due in another week. She had taken Lil to the city hospital for an examination. I put down the phone and I sat next to it for a long time, as if there was someone I could call to say, "Give me another month or so on this, just a little more time, and the weather will break and the crowds will come out to Robbins, and I'll be able to take care of this thing right." I went to a friend of mine that day, Pat Toomey, a man I've been avoiding. "I know I owe you some money," I said, "but a man has 2 ways of borrowing. He can ask and he can tell. I'm telling you, I need bus fare to St. Louis. One way. My baby will be born next week." "I didn't know you were married, Greg." "No one knows." Pat gave me the money and I went down to St. Louis. The first thing I did when I got off the bus was walk 3 miles to the Red Cross office. I gave them my name at the desk and took a seat. While I was waiting to be called, I looked over the Red Cross workers at their desk and picked out a nice-looking gray-haired lady. She had a warm, friendly face. She would understand. I'd make a deal. If the Red Cross lent me money so my baby could be born in a private hospital, I would give them half of everything I'd ever make in my life. The weather is going to clear, and then I'm going to hit it big starting next week, and you can't afford to turn this deal down. "Mr. Gregory?" It was a man in the far corner. I sat down and I explained the situation. I told him I had a nightclub in Chicago, that I was an entertainer temporarily broke, and that the baby was due the next week. You know, Mr. Gregory, we have a very fine city hospital right here in St. Louis, and your wife will be well taken care of. Let me give you the address. I didn't tell him that I knew the address, that I could remember the day a doctor slapped me and cursed my mama in that very fine city hospital. How could I explain to him, a man I was begging from, that I didn't want my kid born in a city hospital? Thank you, sir, I said. Thank you very much for your time. I guess you're right. I walked out of the Red Cross office and around the block and down the street, walking and praying and thinking, and suddenly I had an idea. I started running. When Ron was at Notre Dame, he got a hernia, and a doctor from St. Louis operated on him for free. I ran to a phone booth and started looking through the book until the name came to me. He had an office across town. I ran right over. I paced in front of it for 2 hours until I had the courage to walk into the office of a white doctor who didn't even know me. He was sitting there with a pleasant smile. I'm Dick Gregory, Ron Gregory's brother, and why, of course I remember Ron. You know that day he took the mile at the... We sat there and we talked, and I talked about Notre Dame as if I had built that school with my own two hands, and I talked about Ron as if I had lived in his soul. Whenever we were ready to stop talking, I talked some more, just to put off begging from a white man I didn't even know. He must have sensed it on my face, or 45 minutes was just as long as a doctor could take. By the way, is there anything I can do to help you? Yes, sir. I have a wife here in St. Louis that's going to have a baby next week. I have no money. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. How much do you need? The world stood still and turned beautiful, and I remembered when I was a kid and had a wallet, and an angel came down and whispered something, and I was so happy and bursting inside I could never have believed man had ever fought a war, or hated or been cruel. I said, how much will you need, Mr. Gregory? I don't know, doctor. How much does it cost to have a baby? He called his nurse in. Would you call the hospital and make an appointment for... What's your wife's name? Lillian Gregory. For Lillian Gregory. Tell them she'll be in next week, and that they should hold the bill for me. Doctor, I don't know how to thank you. The blood was running through my veins again, and I wanted to kiss him and hug him and give him all the joys and pleasures I ever had in my whole life. When I got out on the street again, I talked to the trees and the birds, and I nodded at the police car, and I ran all the way to my sister's house, and I couldn't wait for the elevator, so I ran up 11 flights of stairs and burst into the apartment, and grabbed a wife I hardly knew and hadn't seen in almost 4 months. Hey, baby, let me tell you what happened today. She sat there, her face shining. Oh, Greg, oh, Greg. I was talking fast again. I told her what to do and where to go and how she was going to be all right. Now, baby, I've got to find some money to get back to Chicago and open up the Apex Club tomorrow night. Somehow she understood, even though she shouldn't have had to. I went by my aunt's house, and they started screaming at me. What a disgrace you are doing a woman like you're doing. I tried to explain to them this thing I had, that it was bigger than you and me and my wife and the baby. They started screaming again, and I had to leave my aunt's house running. I got some bus fare for myself and some car fare for Lil, and I went back to Dolores's. My sister was home and she took me aside. Lil wasn't eating. She wasn't talking or doing much of anything. She sat around the house taking care of Dolores's kids and sleeping and crying, sleeping and crying. Lil was crying when I left the apartment, and as I slammed the door behind me, I heard her scream, "Please don't leave me again." I went back into the apartment and into the room where she was sobbing on the bed, and she looked up and said, "I'm sorry, Greg. Please forgive me." All the way back to Chicago, I tried to figure out how a woman could understand what a man was trying to do the way Lil understood, and she didn't even know me yet. It was another miserable weekend in Chicago, raining from Friday to Sunday. This time, it didn't matter too much. I had met a man who reached for his wallet, and my kid wasn't going to be born in a city hospital. On Wednesday night, Dolores called and told me everything was fine. Lil had been thoroughly examined and had been admitted to the hospital that afternoon. The baby was due at any time. Everything was working according to plan. I felt great. My stomach quieted down. The phone rang again on Thursday evening. Richard? Yes. Richard, to the last day you live, you'll never be forgiven what happened to this woman. You'll. What are you talking about? Your baby's born, Richard. Is that right? Wonderful. How's Lil? She's here in the house. And the baby's here in the house. And both of them laying there on the floor. But Lil's at the hospital. They sent her home again, Richard. They said, you called the ambulance. Yeah, they're on their way, Richard. You, let me talk to her. Dolores? Dolores? Richard, she's just lying in there. Lying on her back on the floor looking up at her baby. The hospital told me to put the baby on top of her stomach. Dolores? Oh God, Dolores, is she really there on the floor? Yeah, Richard. But I thought she was in the hospital. She was there all night, Richard, all night long. They acted kind of funny to her, and she's such a strange woman, that Lil. She wasn't having labor pains, so they told her she could go home. And she came home, and then she had the pains, and she was all alone in the house, and she didn't have no cab fare, honest to God, Richard. She didn't have no cab fare, and she just... Dolores? I can't hear you, Richard. Dolores, did she holler much? She hasn't said nothing. I've had 3 babies, Richard, and I always hollered. But she didn't say a word. I came home, Richard, and if I didn't go into that room, I wouldn't know she was in there having her baby on the floor. I can't believe it, Dolores. Oh my God. The ambulance is here, Richard. I hung up the phone, and the next thing I knew, I was running through the rain, just running like a crazy man. And I ran around a corner and right into a guy I knew from the university track team, Brooks Johnson. We both fell down on the sidewalk. Before we got up, I said, will you loan me $10? He never asked why, just reached in his pocket, and then I was up running again, from the south side down to the loop, and I caught the St. Louis bus just as it was pulling out. I fell asleep the moment I sat down, and slept for 7 hours all the way to St. Louis. Then I ran to Dolores' house. Richard, oh Richard, the elevator was so small they had to stand her up on the stretcher, going down 11 floors with the baby against her stomach. Where is she, Dolores? Homer G. Phillips. The city hospital. The old place haunted me down after all. I went right over there, marched up to the desk, and told them I wanted to see my wife. Where is she? What is her name, sir? Mrs. Richard Gregory. Certainly, sir. She's on the 4th floor. Let me give you a slip of paper so you can visit your daughter. Lil was in a ward with 20 other women. Some of them were tossing and groaning, and I was scared to go in. I finally did, and Lil looked up at me, and all she said was, "Hi, Greg, I'm sorry." "Oh, Lil, don't be sorry for nothing. It was... Oh, God, Lil, are you all right?" She smiled. "I'm just fine, Greg." She waved her hand to make me come closer, and she whispered, "Greg, will you mind saying something nice to the lady in the bed over there? I've been telling her all about you." I did, and then I went up to see my baby girl, and then I spent more time with Lil, and then I looked at my baby again, and then I went back down to the 4th floor. It's Friday, Lil. I got to go back and open up the club. I understand, Greg. We'll be all right. Don't you worry. When the bandsmen walked into the Apex Club that night, I was standing by the door, and I told every one of them that I was a daddy, and if they wanted to hold on to their jobs, they better bring gifts for my baby. I walked around that weekend in a daze, sometimes proud because I was a father, sometimes ashamed because of what Lil had gone through all alone. On Tuesday, I went back down to St. Louis with $100 worth of baby gifts and $50 I scuffed up for Lil. It was the first time I ever brought anything to my wife. It felt like $50 million to a guy who had let his wife pay for the ring and the blood test and the license and the bus fare out of town more than 4 months ago. For the first time, I began to feel like a husband and a father. Lil was home from the hospital, and I spent 3 days with her. The first time we ever spent any time together as husband and wife. It was the first time I lay in bed with my wife, and touched my wife, and put my back next to my wife's back, and closed my eyes and slept next to my wife. And she was so beautiful, she just lay there and told me how happy she was, and I couldn't believe it. I never will forget how I lay there and tried to tell her that I knew what she had been through, that I knew she had to hate me, and I didn't blame her. She cried and shook her head and said, "Hate you for what, Greg? You're going to be the biggest entertainer in show business someday, and you did what you had to do. Someday you'll sit back and you'll see we didn't go through anything." I couldn't believe this woman existed. We slept and we talked, and we cried and laughed together for 3 days, and we began to know each other. So shy and bashful, that little girl I married, and now she was a woman. We talked about naming the baby Michelle Renee Gregory. You know, Greg, when I was lying on that floor, I thought, Dick Gregory's child is going to say, Dick Gregory's my daddy. Never going to say, I was born on the floor. Just say, Dick Gregory's my daddy. You can do anything you want to do, Greg. You know that I know that. And don't let anything stop you. I told Lil that I was thinking about quitting show business. Hell, I'm nothing but a peon. Never worked in a big nightclub. Never even been inside of one. She shook her head and touched my cheek. We held each other very tight those days and nights in St. Louis, and I began to discover who I had married. And I found out I loved her. And I learned again how a woman can give strength. Those things you told me about your mother, Greg, Lil would say. If she could do all those things for 6 of you, I can do anything you want me to do. I understand you can't always come down here. I look for you every day. And when the day is gone and the week is gone, I just keep seeing you coming. And I know you're on your way. I went back to Chicago that weekend, and the weather was clear and bright and warm. And the highways were dry and smooth, and the Apex Club was packed. It was June, and the long winter was over. Real live crowds now. The money was starting to come in. We're going to hit, baby, because we suffered through the whole storm, and now the weather has broken. June went, and July came, and there were lines outside the door. Every time I stood on that stage, I felt the monster seep right up in me. And I was funny, and every show was a masterpiece. I had spent 6 months in my own nightclub creating and developing my own comedy. The crowds came, and the Apex Club was beginning to really hit. I lost the nightclub in July. Old Lady Wells was very nice, but there was all that money I owed her, and she was getting on in years. There were some buyers looking over the place now. The place had a name. This was the time to sell. Sally Wells gave me a chance. There was the money I owed her for the licenses and the heat and the electricity and the water and the taxes. There was 4 months worth of back rent. $56 a night times 3 nights a week. 4 weeks to a month times 4 months. Has to be in by Sunday, Mr. Gregory. That was it. There were no more tomorrows or next weeks. There were no more people to borrow money from. The last weekend, the owners-to-be came out and looked the place over again, and smiled at each other at the size of the crowd. I remember giving my show while they walked around the room and talked to each other about how they would decorate the club when they took it over. Well, we went out like champs. After the last show on Sunday night, we threw a big party and drank and danced and talked, but mostly cried. We had worked together through one of the worst winters in Chicago, and we hadn't made any money. But for 6 months, every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we could look forward to being somebody's, to being part of something ethical and honest and decent. A place where the customer was always treated right and the employees got respect. A nightclub that had never had gambling or prostitution or bootleg whiskey. A nightclub that, for us, had been something like a home. It was early in the morning before that party broke up. I looked at those sad faces and I made a speech. I thanked them for their faith. I told them what they had seen. A boy had turned into a man before their eyes. I told them, if you carry 50 pounds on your back and don't weaken, you strengthen your back to carry 100, and then 1,000. And if that doesn't break you, someday you'll be able to carry the world and walk with it. That's how strong I feel. At dawn, I walked down the steps of the Apex Club for the last time, thinking of all the trails I had made across the streets, the people I had known, the lessons I had learned, the tests I had passed. Goodbye, Apex. Goodbye, and thank you so much. There will be no turning back now. I'm ready.